Muscle protein synthesis is what we use to measure the incorporation of amino acids into tissue, and this is believed to be over time. It is what you would think of as a biomarker. It is a physiological process that we can measure. It does not necessarily mean that muscle protein synthesis will generate from the amino acid alone the building of new muscle. I mean, we assume it will over time. We assume over time there's muscle accretion, but that again also takes a stimulus. It also takes a physiological adaptation through training. But the muscle protein synthetic response is a response of the tissue. And again, it's this incorporation into these amino acids into the tissue. But it doesn't, and it's necessary to prevent sarcopenia. Again, in my opinion, it's necessary to preserve and protect skeletal muscle. But does it mean that it will build skeletal muscle alone? No, and that's not why individuals necessarily look at muscle protein synthetic response. But is it necessary for that response to happen for the health of tissue? Yes.
All right, I think we still need to hash this out a little bit more because
it's actually pretty complicated.
Yeah, because I'm picturing amino acids coming in, and we're talking about building of tissue using those. So right away, my mind goes to building muscle. But you're saying that is part of building muscle, but not necessarily happening every time when we have muscle protein synthesis.
Not at all.
Okay.
So the 24-hour muscle protein synthetic response is probably the bigger picture. How much of a response did you get? Again, I think there's a lot of nuance, which is why we're going to do a whole show on this with Don. But one thing is for certain is we do need that response for the health of skeletal tissue. You do need that response. And we do know that response translates over to protecting lean tissue. Another thing to note is that to the degree of the response, you can't always measure it, right? So I think in order to really measure a change in tissue, it might have to be greater than 15%. We use it. It's a generally accepted biomarker. Does it directly translate to muscle mass? No, it doesn't.
Got it. But there is some kind of building. It's an anabolic process.
It is an anabolic process. And that's a very good question.
Okay. So let's get into the nuances. Somebody has that bolus of protein. Whenever their first meal is, they can intermittent fast or not. Say it's 10 a.m., just again, giving an example here. And they have 40 grams, and we should be specific here, of animal protein, because there is a difference between animal and plant, and we can get into that in a little bit. Talk about what happens in the muscle. We'll call it MPS because it's a long term there. Talk about MPS when we take in that bolus and what's happening physiology-wise.
Yeah, well, the skeletal muscle is a nutrient-sensing organ, and that is part of what it does. It senses the quality of the diet, and it is exquisitely sensitive to leucine, one of the branched-chain amino acids. When there is a sufficient amount of leucine, then it stimulates mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin, which then is a precursor for a lot of it's a protein complex, and there is a very large complex cascade that happens and ultimately results in a muscle protein synthesis. There's a few other things I think are important to point out. This muscle protein synthetic response could last for a few hours. Maybe it lasts for 2. But the other initiation factors like EIF4 and the other factors, again, if you were to look at this in a diagram, there is just a very complex system. Once you stimulate a mechanistic target of rapamycin, again, there are other initiation factors that have also been activated. And that is why the first meal is so important because number one, it's really been studied and we know that it has value. we've seen that, there was this, I think it was Arnell, some of the earlier protein distribution papers looked at something called, it was in women called and protein pulsing. And what they did is they did they looked at somewhat of the distribution. They looked at 2 small meals of protein. So it was an average of 70 grams of protein in a day. They looked at 2 small meals and then 150 gram bolus meal. And they saw a greater retention in lean tissue over time. But yeah, so all of that is to say that this first meal is very important. And to my knowledge, there's no data regarding the physiological, the biochemical effect on that second meal. So are these initiation factors still elevated at that second meal? Maybe, I think it's important that we don't necessarily know, but then that's where the 24-hour protein ingestion comes into play, because that's also very important. But that first meal has been very well studied. In fact, all the data that I've seen.
You mentioned there being a bunch of different initiation factors, and we know the leucine threshold and getting that bolus of protein is part of this. But if we're having that 30 to 50 grams of protein, does that cover all the initiation factors?
Yeah, it does. It's really based on that stimulation of mTOR through leucine.
And when it comes to 30 to 50 grams, is it just about the leucine?
So I'm going to answer that question in 2 ways. It is about the leucine because as skeletal muscle changes over time, the physiology of the muscle changes. It is thought to become more insulin resistant over time. Again, I was just arguing with Don about this because I don't necessarily believe it does just naturally become more insulin resistant. And I'll tell you what he said. So I said, Don, it's not that it just becomes more insulin resistant. And he said, no, there are clear changes in skeletal muscle because an 80-year-old, even if they've lifted their whole life, they're not going to be as big as they were when they were in their 30s. And I was like, okay, so maybe there is this physiological process that happens. But anyway, so I digress. So skeletal muscle is thought to become more insulin resistant over time. It is thought to also become more anabolically resistant, meaning the efficiency to utilize dietary protein, specifically the efficiency to utilize leucine, becomes somewhat blunted.
Is that as we age or as we put on muscle mass?
Allegedly. No, it's allegedly as we age. Could also be with obesity, anything that challenges the integrity of the muscle. So anything that challenges the integrity of the muscle can affect the processes of that tissue, the efficiency. I think that's a better way to put it, the efficiency of that tissue. The 30 to 50 grams comes from that leucine threshold. If you're eating high quality protein, you're getting a minimum of 2.5 grams of leucine, which is necessary to stimulate that process of mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin. If you do not hit a threshold, you won't stimulate it. It is kind of I'm talking about it as an on and off switch, but there's low levels of mTOR activation that are going on all the time. But just from a muscle perspective, because there's mTOR in every cell in the body, but from a muscle perspective, this stimulation requires a particular amount of protein. When you're younger, you could get away with 1.8 grams of leucine. So when you're really young, I have 2 really little kids, 2 and 4, they don't need a protein distribution. They don't need a bolus of protein because they're growing. They're driven by hormones. They're in a growth phase. They don't require an anabolic stimulus from dietary protein. I think a better way of saying that is they don't require a leucine threshold, right? They could easily get away with 5 grams of dietary protein because, again, they're always growing, up until a certain age. I would say if I were to pick a number at around 30, when hormones potentially are changing, or maybe it's 32, or maybe it's 35, the efficiency of that muscle goes down. And in order to have muscle respond like younger muscle. So in order to have older muscle respond like younger muscle, you have to increase the dosing of that protein. And that's where potentially going up to the 40 to 50 gram really kind of maxes out the system. Yeah. And there's some really early work. I would say another hallmark study would be Katsanos did some of these earlier studies where he looked at, or his group looked at younger individuals in their 20s and then older individuals, 65, and found that the younger individuals will get a full robust response with 1.8 grams. And that when an older individual was given a 2.5, maybe it was 2.5, 2.8 grams of leucine, that older tissue responded like younger tissue.
This right here is my favorite protein powder, the 100% grass-fed bone broth protein from Paleo Valley. It comes in 3 flavors, unflavored, chocolate, and vanilla. The chocolate and vanilla you can just mix with water. They taste incredible just like that. And I like to take the unflavored, scoop it in my black coffee, mix it in. I barely taste it, but I'm getting that collagen and protein boost. These protein powders have been third-party tested for over 40 different herbicides and pesticides. They've come back negative. There's no chemicals or solvents used in the processing, just water. As a viewer of the show, click the link in the description to save 15% off this protein today. Again, this is my favorite protein. I know you're gonna love it. All right, there's some nuance here I want to make sure we clarify before we move forward. So as a young child, we don't have to worry about the protein bolus. But when we get to about 30, that's when the 30 to 50 grams comes into play. And then if we take it beyond that, somebody around Don's age, I think he's in his mid-70s, it sounds like in that bracket, or somebody who's obese might need to even up that even more. Is that correct?
Well, it's safe to say that as we age, we need more protein. That is safe to say. Is there any evidence to suggest going above 1.6 grams per gram per kilogram of body weight? Not necessarily. You're not necessarily going to get a more of a muscle sparing effect. Again, there's a lot of things to consider. Perhaps if you're in a calorie deficit, yes, but if you're eating a normal diet that is not at maintenance, not in a calorie deficit at 1.6 grams per kg, do you need to go above, above that? Is there evidence to support that double that number would be more beneficial? I would say no. And I would say that the aging literature would say anywhere between 1.4, maybe 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kg.
All right, let's take a hypothetical situation here. Somebody
I love those.
Decided to, they understand what we just said, but they're trying to hack it.
Okay.
And we get a leucine supplement.
Oh.
And then we mix that with, say, a green smoothie in the morning. How would the body react to that?
I don't think that that's a great solution, because when you think about amino acids, they all have their own ratios. And a branched chain amino acid ratio would be a 2 to 1 to 1 ratio of leucine, isoleucine, and valine. If you just give leucine, the mechanisms, you would deplete the others. It exists within a system. So you wouldn't, from that perspective, want to supplement a single amino acid. And also, if your goal is protecting skeletal muscle or potentially even putting it on, you need all the amino acids, essential and non-essential.
What about carbs and fat with that 30 to 50 grams? Do they matter though? Right. What if it's just protein by itself? Are those components in MPS?
Insulin can be a driver of muscle protein synthesis as well. Is it going to be as robust as some of the others? Not necessarily.
Like, would it be a limiting factor is what I'm getting at, if it was just protein and not carbohydrates and fat for MPS?
For muscle protein synthesis for the response, I would say that carbohydrates would not be a limiting factor. No.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at. Or fat. Yeah. So it's just protein. No. It's not like you have to have that protein within a certain ratio of other macronutrients for it to take place.
No. And when you think about muscle protein synthesis, the muscle protein synthetic response, it can be driven by increase in total calories or insulin, driven by leucine, driven by resistance training, driven by growth factors. But the primary driver in skeletal muscle of the mechanism that we're talking about is leucine. It would not be, carbohydrates would not be a limiting factor.
So you just mentioned quickly there the fact that exercise stimulates it as well. Say somebody was to do a fasted workout in the morning and they really pushed it with resistance training in the gym, haven't had any protein, no leucine going in. What happens with MPS?
I mean, that's another way to stimulate it. The muscle protein synthetic response is stimulated by resistance training.
But would it really go anywhere if there was no amino acids coming in through the diet to keep it going?
You would not build muscle if you did not have dietary protein. What is also important to recognize is there's a synergistic effect between resistance training and dietary protein. And we have seen that in nearly every study. And there are some amazing studies that, for example, if an individual was eating close to a food guide pyramid, right? So you take two different groups. And this was out of some of the earlier work in Lehman's lab when they had started to really think about these things and understand that protein dosing mattered. And just the macronutrient distribution mattered. If you took two groups and you took one and you put them on the RDA for dietary protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram, and then kind of a food guide pyramid picture, 50% carbohydrates, and you still put them in a hypocaloric diet. So you put them in a hypocaloric diet and you compared it with the same total calories. So let's say it's 1,600 calories with a double the RDA dietary protein, 1.6 grams per kg. And what they found just at rest is those individuals who just cut calories lost, 35% of lean mass. The loss was 35% of lean mass. If you compared it to that individual group that had double the RDA, which is 1.6 grams, again, these are still isocaloric, with 2 days of very light resistance training, they lost roughly, it was something like 10%. So there is a synergistic effect between resistance training and dietary protein for the protection of skeletal muscle.
Let's talk about it from an energy perspective. And we've touched on this, but to get into the nuance there, if somebody hits that threshold, you mentioned before MPS being something that is energy intensive. So if somebody is making sure that they have that first meal, getting that bolus of 30 to 50 grams, how does that change the way those calories are metabolized in the body?
This is a very important point. So do you read research a lot? Where do you come up with these questions?
Just reading your book, talking to you and Dawn, and I'm just really into it.
This is an awesome question. This is a really, really intelligent and nuanced question. In the literature, you will see that the influence of this thermic effect of feeding is variable for dietary protein. Sometimes you might see it 10%, sometimes you might see it upwards of 20%, right? There's variation. And the question is, well, if it's just a macronutrient and you're feeding just this thing, which nobody eats just this one thing, why is it varying so much, right? Why is there a variation? If you were to take 100 grams of dietary protein and you think that the thermic effect of food of that would be 20%, so you're actually only getting a net caloric intake of 80 calories, right? Because this process is so expensive. But in the literature, it's a variation of the percentage. Could it be 15%? Could it be 10%? Sometimes it's 20%. And the question becomes, well, why is it so variable? And I believe, and I could speak for Dawn because we've talked about this ad nauseum together, this is what we do, is that it's the amount of protein per meal that actually influences this thermogenic response, but the response is due to the machinery of muscle protein synthesis. Another way of saying that is, let's say you took a protein diet and instead of eating it in a appropriately nutrient distributed way, like we talked about, 30 to 50 grams. You decided to do 10 grams throughout the whole day, right? You're 10 grams here, 10 grams there, 10 grams there. I suspect you would see a change in thermogenesis, that you would actually be utilizing less energy.
Because you're not activating MPS.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the whole other wing of this is the fact that protein is more satiating.
It's more satiating. It's much more difficult to store. It also, we talk about protein, but protein is actually 20 different amino acids, all with unique biological roles. And each amino acid has at least 2 different roles in the body. You think about threonine for mucin production. You think about tryptophan for serotonin, leucine for mTOR, arginine for nitric oxide. So it's not just, we talk about it in a generic term, but it's essential for a multitude of reasons.
And I want to highlight what we just got into. This is something I wanted to make sure we dove into. Up until this point, other than leucine, which we've talked about for the MPS threshold, we've been talking about protein as a whole in general. And yeah, when we're talking about 30 to 50 grams as that initial bolus, there can be such a diverse array of amino acids within that, because that's a good amount of protein. So if somebody's getting that from quinoa versus having a steak, it's going to be a totally different amino acid profile, even if they're having enough calories of quinoa to get the same amount bolus of protein in grams. So, and again, why I'm bringing this up, I want to highlight what you just said there. The fact that for whatever reason, when we talk about protein, we tend to umbrella it under protein as this term. And I know this is one of your core things you like to get into, the fact that we need to break it down because there's a lot more nuance in there.
Yeah, and I think that that's where the future of protein research is going to go, is that each amino acid is thought of as an individual nutrient. And that is where, once we begin to understand that, we will see that these foods are not interchangeable, and that high quality proteins are really, really important. And when you eat high quality proteins and you target skeletal muscle health, everything else falls into place. Right? So these essential amino acids like leucine, lysine, methionine, they're all not equally essential, right? And to say that in a different way, we have a day requirement for leucine. And that would be somewhat of a meal requirement. Whereas lysine, that is really important for carnitine synthesis, that might have a much slower pool turnover, right? Like that pool of lysine turns over much slower. This becomes very impractical for the individual to think about it. It just becomes very complex. Like, am I eating enough lysine? Is this enough methionine? Did I get enough threonine for my mucin production? Because 75% of threonine is utilized for mucin production. Very difficult. But if you understand the complexities of these amino acids, then the lay person will say, okay, I need to hit a high quality amino acid or a high quality food because I recognize that the amino acid profile in plant sources are different than the amino acid profile in animal sources. And it's just not about the total protein number. And that, I believe, is going to be the future, where we are looking at methionine, we are looking at lysine, we are looking at leucine, because those three seem to be the most limiting. And that's, I propose that that's probably where we're going to go at some point.
Well, the way I see it as you're explaining this, 1.0 would be getting to that 30 to 50 grams within that bolus. Mm-hmm. And then 2.0 for somebody who's been there and wants to take it even further would be to make sure that's a certain quality of protein providing the array of amino acids. So for that person who's at that level and they want to make sure they're doing that correctly, you mentioned plant versus animal. Is it just getting your protein through an animal source? Is that going to provide enough of an array?
Yeah, it will. And again, you read the book. I'm not anti-plant. I'm not anti-animal. I'm a physician by training with years of nutritional science experience and training. And the perspective is we have to understand that foods are not interchangeable, and probably the best of both worlds, a diet would include both plants and animal proteins. And it's also, I want to highlight another layer to what we're speaking about. It's not just about the protein. It's not just about the amino acids. It's also about the things that ride along within the food matrix. For example, carnitine, taurine, creatine, all of which are in high amounts in animal-based foods. And, plants have phytonutrients and other vitamins and minerals. But again, we have to think about food as a food matrix. And if you are to eliminate one entire food group, this becomes a major challenge. For example, carnitine. I did this calculation, and I can't speak to the bioavailability of this, but carnitine is important for many things within the body. It's important, for aging, just a whole bunch of things. And it's primarily found in animal foods. And could you find it in some plant food? And I saw that I looked at this calculation, and you would have to eat 8 to 11 avocados to equal one serving to get the needed amount of carnitine in a day. Is the carnitine deficiency in the immediate going to pose a problem? Probably not. But over a lifetime of pretty significant restriction might create an issue.
Okay. Given what you just said, and there's this great graphic in the book where you show a piece of meat and it has all the different nutrients. I think there's about 8 of them around it that are only found in meat, or at least significantly. But what I'm getting at here is, for the person, for whatever reason, we don't have to get into the nuances of this, whether it be religion or ethics or whatever it is, they're not going to include meat in the diet. How would you guide them, given what we've talked about so far when it comes to protein and amino acids and these other nutrients? Have you seen a way to be complete, even if it does require a little bit more nuance to how everything's laid out?
Well, a person could be, you mean to be plant-based and be able to get their needs met?
Yeah, there's 2 different layers, though. The piece of meat, again, in your book with the 8 different nutrients that are, and you talked about the avocados.
Can you get that from plants?
Can we get enough of those nutrients plus enough of the right amino acids to get MPS stimulated on a plant-based diet? Have you found any nuance to helping people? Because no matter what we say, there's going to be a group of people, and it's become very significant within the health and wellness space, that aren't going to adopt animal-based protein for whatever reason.
Right.
So how do we help them optimize their health, or at least do the best they can given what they're going to eat?
Yeah, and that would be, you can definitely get enough protein on a plant-based diet, for sure. Would you keep in mind that the RDA and the discussions of increasing dietary protein are not based on plant-based proteins. So it is based on high-quality proteins. So the RDA at 0.8 grams as a minimum to prevent deficiencies. That's probably not the same for a plant-based individual. It's probably higher for the minimum to prevent deficiencies. So yes, an easy way to do it would be to add shakes. A rice pea blend, soy or tempeh, any of those other things. You definitely could get enough protein. I would also recommend supplementing with creatine, and definitely iron, calcium.
Okay. But there is still a number of nutrients in the book, again, around that piece of meat that people that are vegan aren't getting. So is there anything they can do other than look those up and supplement with them?
I think that they would probably have to supplement.
And the other piece to this too, Don and I got into it, the fact that when it comes to plant-based protein, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, and I want you to clarify this, is it true that we're not absorbing exactly what the label says when it comes to plant-based? We actually need more of it?
Yeah, so these are issues with how they do protein scoring, like this DIAS and PDCAS, which is it's not super relevant for the listener. But the protein in the back of the label, with plant proteins, it could be, the labels are a bit misleading. It could be nitrogen, could be urea. It's not exactly the same as it would be from an animal-based source. It's typically lower.
And you mentioned when it comes to the plant-based diet, I think you said pea protein, but let's come back to animal-based and say it's a whey protein. And coming back to our common theme here of getting that 30 to 50 grams, how do you feel about using a protein whey powder in the morning with something that's a little bit less in protein to get to that number versus somebody that's just having like a piece of steak? Idea. Like, obviously the steak's going to be more satiating, but from an MPS standpoint, having protein powder with a meal that's a little bit less in protein to still hit that threshold,
I think it's a great idea.
Steak, how does that compare?
Whey protein actually can get away with less because the leucine content is so high. It's a great question, and a lot of the times we use shakes around here. We use whey protein shakes. In fact, don't tell my son who's 2, that's what he gets in the evenings instead of milk, because we're trying to cut back on his milk, right? Because it can bind to iron. But a shake has, so a whey protein shake in particular has the highest percentage of leucine. And again, that's really what you're going for. For example, in 1 scoop of whey protein, you might get, 1.8 to almost 2 grams of leucine in 18 grams of dietary protein. So that's great.
And how do you feel about, obviously there's going to be a totally different amino acid profile, but using a whey protein versus some of the other plant-based proteins, whether it be a rice protein, you mentioned pea protein, you have all these, and say you have all these in your pantry, how do you look at one versus the other?
That's a good question. I don't know if I've thought about it so much, but if I were to pick one, my first one would be a rice, what would it be? Maybe a rice pea blend. I'm not excited about pea protein alone. There's other compounds in there, whether it's, I think that there's a lot of compounds that we don't know. Again, it's almost, think about it this way, the metabolomics. So there's metabolomics, there's intermediate nutrients that we don't, I think, necessarily know what they do in high concentrations, because pea protein isolate doesn't exist in nature. It's whereas whey protein could be the top of, cheese or wherever you get it. It's still something that we've developed and been able to use over time, and we know that it has immunoglobulins in it, like alpha-lactalbumin and lactoferrin. If I were to pick, I would probably do something like a rice blend. Again, pea it doesn't have estrogen in it, but it has other molecules, estrogen-like potentially molecules that have some kind of activity. I just don't think we know over time if someone is just consuming a high amount of pea protein, what that's going to be like.
And how do you compare a protein powder that's a whole food, whether it be plant or animal, versus a branched chain amino acid supplement?
Branched chain amino acid supplements only have the branched chains, and that would be like starting a car without putting gas in the car.
Okay, so you're not a fan of those at all?
If you are eating a lower protein meal, if you're a vegetarian and you're eating a lower protein meal, you could use either a branched chain or an essential amino acid mix.
But it sounds like the hierarchy would be like having a steak, having whey protein, maybe some of the plant-based proteins underneath, and then the branched chain amino acids at the bottom?
Yes.
Let's move on.
I like the way you're thinking.
Let's move on to some of the other meals. We've went deep into this breakfast piece and the protein bolus.
There's also something else I want to say about breakfast is, if you're going to be designing, and I'm not anti-carbohydrate, right? People, I eat a lot of carbs myself, actually, quite frankly. That the first meal and pretty much every meal outside of exercise, I don't really recommend above 40, maybe 50 grams of dietary carbohydrates because of the glucose disposal. And I talk about that in the book. You do want to keep insulin in check.
And the other piece to this too, I'll add, as you say that, and we've talked about this, but we haven't nailed on the specific, that protein, looking at it like, a dietitian may, where it's a certain percentage of the diet, you don't do it that way. You look at it again, body weight in pounds to grams. And if we're taking in less calories, coming back to cutting back calories like we talked about earlier, you still have the same amount of protein, and you just lower the fat and the carbohydrates to lower those calories.
Exactly. So protein, dietary protein is the most important macronutrient. It is essential. It is literally what we are made of. Carbohydrates we don't need. We can make it. Fat, what the essential fatty acid need is so little. But dietary protein is irreplaceable. We need to keep up with daily protein turnover, which is anywhere from 250 upwards of 300 some grams of protein that we are turning over every day. From enzymes to body parts to everything and anything that you could think of. If we don't, eat enough, you're never going to eat enough dietary protein to offset that typically. But again, this becomes the pinnacle. This is necessary. Dietary protein is necessary to support over time these processes.
Say somebody tuning in right now is hearing about the importance of protein, and this is new to them, and they're excited, and they're going to go take out their bag of whey protein and start supplementing with a diet that's already high in protein. What I'm getting at here is there too much? Say we do get that up to like 200 grams a day or 300.
Yeah.
How does the body respond?
So we've never seen evidence that something would indicate that we have a diet too high in protein. There was some initial thoughts that maybe because of the disposal of urea, the breakdown of urea and ammonia and etc., would be kind of this upper threshold, but we haven't seen it. I haven't seen that in the literature. We have not seen what a very high protein diet over time will do. And I've seen some data, Jose Antonio's published papers. Again, they're short-term papers, 8 weeks or so, of 3.5 grams per kg of protein per body weight. Yeah, we don't see really any negative benefits or any negative effects.
And what about symptom-wise? Somebody that's been having a low protein diet, they come across your book now or your information or work with you, and then they really up the protein to the level we're talking about here. Do they typically notice a difference in how they feel after a day or a few days? And if so, okay, they do. So what is that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about, at least from my clinical experience, is that when you get protein right and you increase high quality proteins, you begin to balance blood sugar because you're not dependent on, a whole bunch of carbohydrates and fats. You seem to just have a steady level of energy, and you're able to regulate blood sugar over time. And of course, there's this increase in satiation, and you begin to just, I don't know if it's be more sturdy. That's like such a abstract way of thinking about it, but you're getting a lot of nutrients. So whether someone is iron deficient or zinc deficient, it's again not just about the dietary protein, but when you support and build a diet around protein, there's a lot of metabolic benefits. Because again, while we're eating for protein, there are other metabolic outcomes.
Let's move into the other meals now, starting with dinner, because the way I understood it from your book is that the most important is breakfast, again, hitting on that threshold. Mm-hmm. But then second in line, we'll call it, is dinner and making sure we're getting a bolus at that time too. So talk about why that's important.
It's important in the context of if you really got the first meal right, because the large steak dinner has been around forever. And so most individuals will eat lower protein in the first meal, the second meal, and then have a large steak dinner. That is not what we're talking about. This is assuming that you've nailed protein in the first meal, that the next meal after going into an overnight fast is really important. Because number one, you're going into an overnight fast, and this is your opportunity to now protect skeletal muscle as you sleep. And so having that in a robust amount is very reasonable.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
all these metabolic dysfunctions, we put on obesity, when in fact we should put on skeletal muscle. It's a skeletal muscle issue at its core, not an obesity.